Hello and welcome to Modern Desktop Deployment 40. I'm Jeremy Chapman. I'm going to talk about planning a modern desktop deployment to Windows 10 and Office 365 ProPlus. Now, a lot of this is based on how to shift content at aka.ms/howtoshift, where you will find docs on docs.microsoft.com, videos on Microsoft mechanics, and even hands-on labs to go through this training. Let's start with why you would shift, though. Some of the reasons I think that are core in terms of moving: one, security and information protection are completely improved across all different levels, from the metal and the circuit board all the way up to the running environments of Windows and things that connect to the cloud through Office 365, and even for things like Windows Defender ATP, where you have a mechanism to really stitch together all the different related alerts to form an incident and really do, post-breach investigation, all those things. All of those different areas within kind of the security lifecycle are improved and really meeting, the current demands in terms of, and exceeding the current demands in terms of the sophistication of attacks that we're seeing. So that's a big reason just in general to be moving. And then again, as mentioned earlier, the fact that security updates will run out as of January 2020 from a Windows 7 perspective if you're on that version of the OS. The other thing is just cloud connectivity and what that means from a teamwork and productivity perspective, and being able to get to your work faster through things like, roaming most recently used files list, being able to get to team sites, spin up conversations with your teams via Microsoft Teams, all the different connectivity options that are there to get to your work through Office and Microsoft 365. These are huge benefits. And then finally, the end of support for Windows 7 in January 2020 and Office 2010 in October 2020 are big reasons to move. All right, so what's different compared to the last big desktop deployment? Again, connectivity to the cloud is kind of where it starts. Directory services, this I think a lot of people maybe aren't used to from a previous installation of Windows perspective. There are things, though, for example, like licensing users as part of Office 365 ProPlus that require Azure AD to be in place. Yes, you can minimize the number of attributes, for example, that you might sync from a local directory in order to get Office to activate, but it's going to be something that is really critical to A, deploying the modern desktop, and B, experiencing all the power of the modern desktop. It's really as important as Active Directory was those many years ago, when folks were deploying, Windows XP and Windows 7 and really getting to a point of single sign-on. Now imagine that, though, across not just Microsoft apps, but also third-party apps that they might be using. This really makes using the cloud more powerful. It makes it more safe, and also it exposes folks to modern desktop experiences really that extend beyond even the things that we offer at Microsoft. In-place upgrades are viable. This is something that I would have said was heresy even just a few years ago. Now we've upgraded hundreds of millions of consumer PCs from Windows 7 to Windows 10. I would argue even in terms of 10 to 10 scenarios, we're going from an older version of Windows 10 to a newer one. It doesn't make any sense to not use in-place upgrades. There will be a few edge cases where that is required, but this is something that will save you incredible amounts of time if you're currently doing things like wipe and load, especially on a 10 to 10 scenario that we're seeing a few customers are still doing this, because even Windows 10 versions are treated like a full OS deployment because they're running setup. Now, you should be using in-place upgrades, especially 10 to 10, and when possible, from 7 to 10. Of course, with anything, you should be validating and testing all of that, but this is the recommended and viable option, and especially heavily recommended once you're current or on a version of Windows 10 and staying current with the most recent versions of Windows 10. UEFI. So a lot of the security stuff I mentioned, a lot of the benefits are hinged upon having UEFI in place. So that means a lot of things are going to require 64-bit. A lot of the virtualization-based security, for example, requires UEFI. The things that all the guards as part of Windows, Credential Guard, Device Guard, Secure Boot, a lot of those things are hinged upon having UEFI in place. SLAT support for hardware, virtualization at the hardware level. All of these things need to be there on hardware. Nice thing is most modern PCs, most modern hardware will have that already, so you don't have to replace all the computers out there in the environment. As long as they're usually about 5 years or newer, they're going to have everything. Even some of the older systems will have what's required for UEFI and all the virtualization-based security to run. Intune, hugely important in terms of going to cloud-based management. The nice thing is with Intune, you can actually attach that to Configuration Manager as part of co-management, to where you can get capabilities like Conditional Access with Azure AD, so you can do, for example, multi-factor authentication using Conditional Access and get that deployed in a faster way that uses kind of modern hardware and biometric authentication. And because Conditional Access is actually doing a risk-based assessment on each logon, there are things where the user will typically, in the Office environment at least, only see one factor of authentication. So it makes it easier from a getting users on board perspective to get to the cloud and to get to a modern desktop. Office ProPlus is the preferred option for Office desktop apps, and Click to Run is being used for not just ProPlus and subscription-based Office, but also the volume licensing versions of Office. So it's super critical to be aware of what the deployment tools are for Click to Run, like the Office Customization tool, Office Deployment tool, and then the integration that we've built natively as part of Configuration Manager and tools like Intune to get the initial install configured. The other thing is servicing. So servicing, the biggest change there is, instead of what a lot of organizations do now, wait 5 to 7 years sometimes for updates, these are recommended to be taken every 6 months. You can skip a release or sometimes 2, maybe deploy every year if you're going to do that. We actually have modified the support terms as of September 6th. So the builds that target the September timeframe are supported for 30 months. So in that case, we recommend once a year style deployment targeting those September targeted releases. So that's something that you can do and align really the Office and Windows side into semi-annual channel. So you're not in a position where you have to continually train users or get them ready for new capabilities on the Windows or Office side, and you get the benefit of all the updates from a security perspective as threats evolve and the landscape changes. So let's talk about the deployment process itself. So again, these are all the steps, regardless of OS platform, that you're going to do. Now, the way to think about this chart and the visual is really you start in the middle. Now, do I have my leadership bought into moving to a newer version of Windows and Office? If that's the case, then you can skip the value discovery and business case because they've already bought in. They already know that they have to get deployed. So the next step is really about learning, doing what you're doing, kind of attending conferences like Ignite or reading the Desktop Deployment Center online, but really getting kind of a feel for all the different steps that you're going to be doing and really following the external ring of this wheel. And then building a team, making sure you've got folks on board that can do app compat work, that can optimize network settings, that can configure applications, build packages if it's Configuration Manager that you use, assess any cloud services that you might be using as part of user files and settings sync, looking at what users currently have on their machines. The security team that you're going to want to integrate as part of building your teams out. Looking at your current OS deployment practices and seeing what parts of that you can optimize and really improve, what things you can augment with, say, technology like Windows Autopilot to work with your hardware providers to bring systems in that you can make business ready as users log into them for the first time without having to re-image them, repackage them up, and send them out to your users. Windows as a service, all the servicing things I've mentioned, and then getting users prepared and using all of the modern capabilities that they'll have. All right, so let's start with device and app readiness, 12 o'clock on the wheel. Main thing here is you're inventorying and getting all of the components that you're going to need to move forward from your current environment, which is probably going to be Windows 7 or an older version of Windows 10, maybe an older version of Office like 2010, 2013, or 2016, and bring that into Office 365 ProPlus and Windows 10 on a current or modern version. Now, the preferred way to collect this information is to use Windows Analytics, which is currently the tool in market. Desktop Analytics is coming soon. Both of these are really about getting a view of telemetry that we would use at Microsoft as we make assessments against the 700 plus million machines that we're managing in the broader sense that are not under enterprise management. to determine whether or not they have the right compatibility state, their hardware is compatible, their apps are compatible, and what we then do to proceed with a deployment. Now, the Windows and desktop analytics, they're giving you a scoped view of the machines that are in your environment so that you can make these kind of assessments and also scope to the hardware that you have and the software that you have in place. Now, the Readiness Toolkit for Office, we'll talk about that and show that in a second, but this is really about looking at COM-based add-ins, the traditional add-ins in Office, and also VBA macros that might be running in your current files in your Office environment. So there is a modern way to do add-ins with Office. We're not going to talk about that. It's more around the Windows side of COM add-ins and what we can do to make that better. Finally, once we've got kind of all the compatibility information, then we start to work through the application and hardware inventories to make sure that you've got a sufficient level of compatibility to start targeting computers for deployment. As you work through those different reports, you're going to see that certain populations of hardware and software are ready for deployment, and then you can use those as part of your collection building with tools like System Center Configuration Manager to target the upgrades for Windows and for Office. Then you'll continue triaging those until all the machines that you're targeting are ready. And if you do find things that are busted or apps that you need to remediate, that's where you can work with a new offer called Microsoft Fast Track's Desktop App Assure that will give you the ability to contact Microsoft engineers to help work through compatibility issues. And the last thing kind of really to consider is if what you have from a intranet or internet or even SaaS-based app perspective, what sites are being most frequently visited, what things need to work moving forward onto Windows 10, and ensure those work in Edge or the browser that you're going to be targeting in the new Windows environment. All right, so let's talk about compatibility first on both the Windows side and the Office side. Main thing is apps and add-ins will just work. 99% plus Windows 10 apps, we've stated this publicly. We didn't make massive changes to public APIs. We've done a lot of work under the covers to make sure that apps continue to work. On the Office side, add-ins also, arguably, there have been very, very few changes from Office 2007 until now. From 2010, especially a few changes, because in the 2013 timeframe, we actually introduced the new extensibility model at the time called Office Apps, now called Office Add-ins, that didn't use COM, that was basically a manifest of an XML file that called web content, whereas a COM add-in is running local, full trust code against an Office client. Now, the things, kind of the tips here, the 1%, so to speak, antivirus and VPN and hard disk encryption are the things that you'll run into typically on the Windows side that you'll want to pay particular attention to. And on the Office side, a tip is if you're moving to 64-bit Office, COM add-ins need to be compiled natively 64-bit. So use 64-bit when you can get away with it. 32-bit, we've done a lot of things in terms of memory management optimization performance on 32-bit in case you are held back by COM add-ins. So you can run 32-bit and feel good about it. You can also run mixed mode. But if you can get away with 64-bit and there's nothing really holding you back or very, very few add-ins in your environment, we recommend to do a 64-bit install of Office. All right, so let's talk about analytics for a second. So the things that we do as part of our broader upgrade to Windows 10 current version in the consumer space with all the hundreds of millions of PCs that we upgrade is we're constantly getting signals for app crashes, hardware crashes, compatibility, all the different measurements that we have. We're using that information then to assess which computers and machines we target for upgrades. Now, what Windows Analytics basically does is it gives you a similar view of your computers, the things that are in your environment, and what will be compatible moving forward in terms of going to the build that you're actually targeting. You can input the one that you're going to. For example, if I'm moving to Windows 10 1809, I can put that as the target environment. And then based on the compatibility data that we have from the hardware that's in your environment and the apps that are there, you would get data back that will help you assess the computers that are available and kind of where to focus your testing efforts. What you do basically to get this running is you sign up for a log analytics account in Azure. You then find your organization ID. You will deploy group policy out to the computers that you want to have logging up into the service. And then once that kicks off, it takes around 24 hours for the logging to start and the batch processing of said logs to begin getting processed for analytics. So it'll be about a 1 to 2 day process before you start to see data returned back to you after you've basically triggered machines to start logging up to the service. Then that will start giving you some rich data in terms of how to target upgrades. Now, the Office Readiness Toolkit is something on the Office side where basically you can, either for one machine or multiple machines, install an executable file that will run a quick scan against the running version of Office on the computer and all the different add-ins that are there. It will give you a machine level report, so if you want to test machines individually like you see here in the screenshot, or you can have that roll up into a multi-machine level report. So you can see any Visual Basic that's running, VBA, summary and results, things that you can do to fix any of the code that's there. Importantly, also the add-ins, the COM add-ins that you've detected, whether or not we have compatibility data in our telemetry database of things that have a supported version. Which ones to focus on based on the level of adoption. So if there's 1 or 2 users out of 10,000 that have it installed, don't worry about it. But if you've got several hundreds of users that are using a particular add-in, that's where you can actually see who has it and focus on that for testing. That's another view, by the way, that Windows Analytics will give you when looking at Office add-ins. Something that we're working on now to augment that story even further is Desktop Analytics, which basically takes in some of the Office logic from the Readiness Toolkit, merges that with Windows Analytics, and then gives you additional capabilities such as deployment plans. So you can have different deployment plans based on multiple user populations. So in Windows Analytics, it's kind of a global setting against all users in that analytics environment. Here you can do that based on, say, site, city, region, locale, language, whatever you want to do to slice and dice your user groups up. You can then have different destination versions of Windows 10 if you want for those different populations, and it will even help you assess the right computers to use as part of your test environment. So these are things that we're working on as part of Desktop Analytics as we announced it in Ignite in September of 2018. Both tools, whether it's Windows Analytics or Desktop Analytics, will integrate with System Center Configuration Manager, so you can get reporting through that console and create your deployment collections and execute against them as part of your configuration manager environment. All right, so as mentioned earlier, Desktop Aperture, it's a brand new service from Fast Track at Microsoft that really gives you the ability to work with our engineers. If you find some apps that are in that 1% of things that do not work, whether they're line of business apps or ISV developed apps or Microsoft developed apps, we can work with you to get those fixed, whether it's a app fix, a Windows fix, a shim, whatever's required to get that running, we will work with you. This is something that we're rolling out globally as of February of 2019. Now, the main thing here to remember as part of Desktop Aperture is that this is remote assistance, so it's going to be through remote communication. We're not going to be sending a consultant on site. These are things that you've probably already paid for as part of your subscriptions to Microsoft 365 or enterprise versions of Windows. And it works for third-party applications as well as any LOB apps, line of business apps that you've developed. This gives you direct contact or communication with Microsoft engineers who are skilled in the art of compatibility remediation, who can help work with you on those apps. So those are kind of the core application and hardware readiness considerations to make and the tools that we have. Moving on to directory network readiness, this is one of those things that isn't always thought through completely before the deployment happens, but once you're kind of in the scaling side of getting massive numbers of machines deployed, you will start to hit these as bottlenecks if you don't start to plan around network consumption of bandwidth, connectivity back to the internet, things like peer caching, etc. So there's a few different technology areas, especially here, to consider, and I'll go through each of the different things to think about. Main thing is we've thought through a lot of these potential bottlenecks and really provided solutions to help in terms of ensuring that you can deploy at scale and at a pace that's going to work with your network requirements. And then the first part of this, if you're not using Office 365 or Microsoft 365 or anything else that requires Azure AD, this is where you deploy that as part of it. And that really also includes licensing elements, for example, as part of your Office 365 ProPlus client apps. All right, so the first thing from a directory, from a network perspective is really peer cache. So if you're using Configuration Manager, nice thing is now with current release or current branch of Configuration Manager, you can set up a well-connected client PC as a source for deployment content. So it acts somewhat analogous to a distribution point and can be used to store a deployment source, and other machines can call it for a deployment source, which will save a ton of network bandwidth, especially if your DPs are located far from the endpoints. You can have, one or two of these per subnet in some cases, where deployment will be sped up exponentially once you configure these as part of your deployment work. LEDBat is something brand new. It's true network optimization, whereas normally throttling might give you not a full spectrum of the bandwidth that you have. LEDBat uses all the spectrum for background tasks, but then instantly pauses activities for any foreground tasks that come. So the nice thing is if you're receiving data from, say, a server 2016 and newer distribution point, the client, if for example I'm not actively using the web or streaming a video or whatever, that DP gets full bandwidth to be able to deliver a deployment source, whether that is a full upgrade image for Windows, for example, or software or driver packages. And then when I do go online, or when I do start to use a web app or something, that will then stop that background process temporarily while I'm using that traffic or needing that bandwidth, and then resume and use what it can as part of the transfer. It means that sometimes stuff that might have taken weeks to go over larger WANs to other sites globally might be something that you can do in hours or days to really speed things up. Nice thing is with LEDBat, it's basically just a checkbox to get it configured, and you can take advantage of that capability as part of Config Manager. It's native to Server 2016 and newer. Okay, so let's talk about Office and LOB app delivery. So this is really about application packaging and configuration, ensuring that you have an automated way to deliver apps, ensuring that you've got a way to replace or supersede apps, and when you need to bring them forward. This is especially the case for things like antivirus or VPN apps, kind of as part of the compatibility story we just talked about. And then another huge aspect of this is just learning about click to run. So this is not just Office 365 ProPlus, but also Office 2019 volume licensing. There is no longer an MSI build of Office in 2019. The old MSI-based Office customization tool does not exist, so you need to know about what your customization options are for ProPlus, as well as the 2019 builds that you're going to be using for Standard or Professional Plus. So this is the Office customization tool. So just to go through what it does, you can do architectural changes as you would expect. This is where you'd also pick the SKU of Office that you want to install. Notice the volume licensing SKUs are there. You can exclude or include apps that you want to have installed. As you make updates to the Office customization tool, everything will be kind of stored on the right-hand side so you can see what progress you're making. You choose your update channel. Again, semi-annual is our recommendation, so you can match it with Windows 10 updates. Here you can also pick things like your language preferences. So one way to do this is to pick the language that's local to your market, and another thing is if you're using CDN or fail back to CDN, which means cloud delivery of Office, You can use match operating system, so it will match the operating system that's on Windows. Now here's one of the things that not everyone understands because it's new. Even though it's Office 365, you can install from local source or configuration manager. We can make it a silent install for users. We can, here from an update perspective, choose where the update engine looks for updates. Configuration manager is what a lot of customers will use, but you can also have it look to a file share or an HTTP path or get updates from the cloud. Importantly, we can remove the MSI version of Office that we find, and we can keep versions like Visio, for example, if we have a VL license that we want to keep. Now this shows where you'd actually enter a product key if you're using 2019 volume licensing, and or even an older version of Visio or Project. And then you can skip the EULA for users so they don't have to see the licensing agreement. And we give it a name of an organization. And this is the new part to the Office customization tool that you couldn't do as part of the Office deployment tool, which is granular configuration. Things that used to be only preferences in the Office customization tool for the MSI are now controls that you can leverage via this tool. It's going to generate an XML file, and then that you'll use with the Office deployment tool as part of your deployment routine. Now, the other nice thing with this tool is that it's integrated and native as part of Configuration Manager. So when you go through the Configuration Manager deployment process, basically you click on, within Software Library, Office 365 Client Management, create an Office Client App Package. That's going to spin up these set of screens that you see here. Those will also do all of the settings through the Office customization tool that we just saw. So you can either import an XML that you just built, or you can use the native controls within Config Manager to author the XML files as part of what you're using for deployment of the click to run packages. Main thing is it's part of the normal application flow. Now, one of the things that's brand new with Office is the ability to convert a volume licensing version of Office 2019 to ProPlus with just one group policy setting. So if you go into administrative templates and the Office settings, you can see that in the upgrade settings, there's a attribute here that lets you, or a policy that lets you convert a 2019 build of Office. So here in this case, I've got a 2019 build. I've set that attribute. Now I had to run GP update in order for the policy to update. What that's going to do is then listen for the next time Office will request an update. And now if I go into one of my Office apps, like it's Excel, I can manually trigger the update, or it happens also automatically through scheduled tasks, but I'll manually trigger in this case. And when I do that, I will go ahead and go to the Backstage, my account, and I'll see that I've got 2019. And then I'll see my update options and go ahead and update that. And what that's going to do is update Office, which is going to change the activation channel as well as the servicing channel. So now I'm on Office 365 ProPlus. So if I go into Add Remove Programs again, which before had Office 2019 as the version, now you see that we're on Office 365 ProPlus. So we've just switched without uninstalling and reinstalling from Office 2019 VL to subscription version of Office 365 ProPlus. A couple other things to mention since we're talking about application packaging. If you want to take advantage of things like the store and the UWP, Universal Windows Platform, for apps, you can use Desktop Bridge. This is one tool that you can use, the Desktop App Converter. You can also use Visual Studio. But basically, this will convert an existing Win32 app for UWP. Another thing that you can do is use the MSIX package type. And basically, this will convert similar to the tool that we just saw, but it will monitor the installation. It will create an MSI package of the app that you can distribute via store or other means. And the nice thing with this is that with standard user privilege and context, if say you're on an S mode version of Windows even, you'll be able to have that kind of integration with Windows that you'd expect from an app that installs with full system level privilege. But now, since we're monitoring the install here and creating the package, we know the different extension points that the app's looking for, and we can have those kind of capabilities from an app that's installed in store on a on a machine that's running in standard user context or S mode context, which is nice in terms of security, that the machine doesn't have to have the user running under full admin privilege. And that basically will create the app package for you. With that, you can use the store or other means to install the app. That's something that's generally available now, and also something that you can use as part of packaging apps moving forward that doesn't have any real, it doesn't have downsides in terms of what you're used to from a normal installer that's I should say a current installer that's installing Win32 apps via Bootstrap or via MSI. You get a lot of those same benefits from MSIX using effectively what is a hybrid of virtualization of the application and ensuring that it is outputting a format that works as a store-based app. So let's move on to user files and settings. So the first thing to think about here is that even though we might have a great process for automating bare metal machines, we might be using things like Autopilot so that when a user unboxes their machine as part of a first run experience, ultimately, if you don't think about user files and settings and how to move stuff from old computer to new computer or old install of Windows to new install, users will ask where their stuff is, and they will come up with creative ways to try to bring their stuff back. These are tasks that you can help people do, and you can actually automate in a lot of cases to save you time and to save users time and really meet their expectations. So in theory, and kind of the way that user files and settings transfer works and migration works is that you have an old PC, typically that migrates files off to a central area of servers, then we have to migrate that back onto the new PC or the new image of Windows. Those servers could be cloud-based, they could be local, they could be a USB drive storage attached to the computer. There are many ways to get the files off that machine and then stored somewhere temporarily to where they can be placed back onto a machine. Of course, there are issues there around security of the files. Will that store be encrypted, etc.? How robust is the process? All those different things that you'll want to test and that we've got tools for. A lot of folks, though, are using desk side visits to do this, because a lot of users will use this as an opportunity for a little bit of kind of spring cleanup to not bring everything from their old PC to their new PC. The problem is it doesn't scale that well if you've got to do hundreds or thousands of these. So what's the best way to migrate? And this is where you might use tools like OneDrive known folder move that I'll show you in a sec, as well as user state migration tool or scripted based options to do that. Now our recommendation currently is to use the modern kind of OneDrive known folder move approach, which says that your files will be synced with the OneDrive service in the cloud. They will be protected there. Effectively, you can do things like roll back to previous versions of those files after a week, if, for example, you were infected by a ransomware, those types of things. And it's something that you can set up now either manually, or you can use policy to enforce it and really do kind of a zero touch or a no visit to desktop setup silent install for users on their behalf. Now the way to do it manually, if you want to get it working just to start testing on your own PCs, you go into OneDrive, you sign into OneDrive, go into the settings, go into the autosave tab on settings, start protection. That will protect the desktop, pictures, and documents folder. Doesn't protect additional folders, and you can't customize it, the tool natively, to add other folders to it or exclude file types or some of the other things that a lot of people ask about. You can do things like manage bandwidth, throttle it for upload and download speeds. You can control user behavior and what they're allowed to change and modify, those types of things, and whether or not they see that there's a sync in progress. And we'll show those in a sec in the policies that you can use. So the nice thing is here you can configure all of this to run in the background. So this is the silently redirect Windows known folders to OneDrive. You see there's a tenant ID as well as a notification that you can send to users after folders have been redirected. So they see that why maybe you've got files on demand turned on, why there are different icons now next to their files in the Windows Explorer view. Now, the other things that you can do, as mentioned, things like maximum percentage of upload bandwidth, how you want to allow syncing if you don't want to sync private OneDrive accounts or other company accounts on a machine that you manage. Like, a lot of these things are additional settings that you can use in terms of governing how OneDrive is used in the organization. Team site auto mount is another capability using the same policy area and the same kind of policies I just showed, which can be used as a replacement for mapped drives or mapped network drives for file shares. Now, what you do is you migrate your file share up into SharePoint Online. Then effectively use the policy, one of the policies that I showed earlier, to enforce sync of those locations. So you need the SharePoint team site ID. That will then sync the folder down into that user's computer via the policy, and it will basically act as if, when a user was to hit the sync button on a site. It's not going to handle permissions or give you special abilities if you don't have permissions to a SharePoint site or set of sites. So only the ones that users have permissions to access will actually be visible to them in the Explorer menu. So it's good from a permissioning and security consistency perspective as well. That said, there are additional user state topics that you need to be aware of, things like user accounts, user files, user OS settings, the app settings that need to be carried over from an old install of an app to a new one. OneDrive known folder remove isn't bringing over Windows user profiles. It's bringing over their files, but from those three locations of documents, pictures, and desktop. Now, if you've got additional folders that you want to bring over, that's where you need scripted solutions or things like USMT to do that. Same thing with OS settings. Nice thing with OS settings is there is an option to use enterprise state roaming that will allow things like the desktop, internet favorites, some of the taskbar customizations, things like that to move from machine to machine, and it's a setting that you can set as part of Azure AD. And app settings, you can customize that using USMT. It's a little bit trickier, and not a lot of partners or organizations have expertise in doing this. So a lot of app settings will be a lot of the reason why you'll still be doing, in a lot of cases, manual desk side visits to ensure that default file associations, those types of things, or app preferences are set for non-Microsoft apps especially. So the tool that you'll use for most of these user state migration tool is part of things like Microsoft Deployment Toolkit or System Center Configuration Manager. Now this again is governed by XMLs that do things like migrate user settings through miguser.xml and migrate app settings through migapp.xml. These can be customized, as you see here, using Notepad or your preferred text editing tool in order to do that. Again, USMT is built into Config Manager and MDT, so it's native to the process. That said, we're seeing that a lot of people build their own custom migration solutions based on specific needs that you do via PowerShell or some other means through scripting, so that you can manage that process in a repeatable way. Some of the other considerations, and these are to some extent covered with enterprise state roaming, but things that you might want to do to make sure that you have a consistent start and taskbar experience. You can actually build out a custom start layout on a machine. You can then capture that through the export start layout command. That's going to give you an XML once you've created the perfect start layout and the perfect taskbar that you can then use policy or MDM and CSP templates or other things, PowerShell, to deploy out to your system. So they all look and feel the same, have the same apps there. Now, the other consideration is around removing unwanted apps with PowerShell. Maybe you don't want various games or things that are in box as part of Windows 10. You can do that online via the Remove AppX Package PowerShell commandlet. And you can even use a mounted install.wim or a WIM file that you've captured, use dism.exe, and then remove that offline via image servicing. So one thing to note on image servicing, you can add and remove packages, you can add application runtimes, And in those cases, an in-place upgrade will continue to work, but you can't go online, create a brand new image, and then use that as an in-place upgrade. That's not a supported scenario. So this is something that if you do offline automated image curation, this is something that you might do as part of that offline set of steps where you're mounting the install.wim, removing application packages, adding the runtimes that you need, adding cumulative updates, for example, and then resealing the image, and then you can use it as part of an upgrade task sequence, for example, and everything will continue to work. All right, so let's talk about security and compliance. This is kind of towards the 6 o'clock side of our wheel. Now, this is where you're looking at the current tools that you have in place around security and compliance. Look at compatibility of things like antivirus and VPN software, and also disk encryption. Then looking at new capabilities that you want to have as part of Windows 10 and cloud-attached capabilities through Azure AD, or things like Windows Defender ATP, for example. Now, all of these things are considerations that you'll make as part of security and compliance. Again, the things that you'll want to look at from a compatibility perspective are disk encryption, antivirus, VPN. One other thing to note is GPOs, so group policy objects that you might have authored or been moving forward since older versions of Windows may not work in a Windows 10 environment. Disk encryption-wise, the reflect drivers switch as part of setup might be an option depending on which disk encryption that you use if it's not BitLocker. But with BitLocker, the nice thing is you can actually suspend and resume BitLocker for upgrades, so it's a lot easier to use as part of the Windows upgrading process. Now, for antivirus and anti-malware, these are just a list of the things that you can find on our public pages for partners in that space and different ISVs that support Windows 10 and have a public support statement. From a security policy perspective, you use security baselines as part of your group policy planning. This actually gives you what all the settings are, all your options per setting, and then will even highlight the things that you might want to do as part of an enterprise deployment. Now, again, as part of the modern desktop, attaching to cloud or cloud identity services through things like Azure Active Directory are going to be key as part of your deployment planning. And again, as part of things like Office 365 ProPlus, required, you have to have them in place for things like activation and sign in to those for those products to work. The other things, if you're targeting solutions like Windows Autopilot, or you want to use Intune either in full or as part of co-management, all of these need Azure AD. Nice thing is, for a lot of organizations, you might already have Office 365 in place. So that means that you can use that existing deployment of Azure AD. It also opens up things like Windows Hello for passwordless authentication as part of MFA, multi-factor auth, as part of your solutions with Azure AD. So it can even help in terms of leveraging new hardware capabilities and upping your security level from a credential theft or authentication and authorization perspective. The way to get things like conditional access configured is using co-management. This is just one of the controls that you'll see as you configure that. Use the compliance policies as part of Intune. That will enable you to use, for example, conditional access as part of Azure AD Premium in order to have that in place. You can also use it for the other things listed here, for endpoint protection, click to run, Windows Update policies using Windows Update for Business, etc., where this basically determines who owns those classes of settings, whether it's Intune or Config Manager. Main thing with a modern desktop is it's constantly evolving, and it's evolving for new threats. So part of these updates are things that you could not add to a Windows 7 environment through normal servicing. So that's why we are, in the case of a feature update, literally updating every part of the Windows OS and those runtimes, because there are things that sometimes are even down closer to the silicon level that require updates to be resilient to modern threats. So one of the things in that class of protections is virtualization-based security. This is where we actually use containerization to obfuscate or separate secrets or things that you want to protect from the running host OS. So now moving to the Office side, we have capabilities like data loss prevention that will give you the ability to do things like detect sensitive information such as credit cards, ID numbers, bank account numbers, etc. and then lock down that file or prevent you from reading, sharing, or consuming that sensitive data. So this is another great way to protect files and also educate users as part of normal information protection. Speaking of the user role in terms of information protection, Azure Information Protection can use the same logic to do automatic protection of files based on the heuristics and the components within the file, but you can also give the user a role in terms of having them mark what is sensitive, because a lot of times finance or legal teams will know that more than an algorithm or IT can know. And finally, post-breach, Windows Defender ATP also gives a means to investigate any issues that you might have seen in your environment, and really give you a full kind of strung together set of alerts in an incident that will tell you what happened, what were the causes of that, how was the system kind of contained, what remediations were executed against it, and once it's healthy, when was it released for use, whether it's a user, a device, or other component. So those are just some of the security considerations that we have around planning for security capabilities moving to a modern desktop. Let's talk about OS deployment and feature updates. Now this is really about kind of inserting the upgrade for Windows as part of the normal hardware replacement and refresh process. B, thinking about in-place upgrades or refreshes that you might have against existing computers that aren't part of the hardware refresh, and what you do for break-fix scenarios. If, for example, you do a bare metal deployment or a new user is hired in, what does that look like, and how do we move to Windows 10? So a lot of it's ensuring that our existing processes work with the newer versions of Windows and Office. And then finally, when we think about how we do just the rollout itself, planning for increasing the number of seats that we're deploying over time using things called phased deployment, so we can continually validate our updates, our automation, our compatibility, and increase the targeted population over time. And then have a process for rollback in case we do have scenarios where we thought that everything was going to work. Maybe Windows setup went through the entire update, but a peripheral or something didn't work. That's where the nice thing about an upgrade is that you can roll that back to the previous copy of Windows until maybe a cumulative update is released that will address that compatibility. So you have the ability to go back in time without modifying the files and as part of the user file store on that local system. So then we're basically getting to a state where we can deploy in a repeatable way, because we're going to be using a lot of these concepts and approaches as we move into feature updating for part of Windows servicing. We think about 4 different scenarios. Refresh, where we're basically wiping and reloading a PC. This is especially the case for, say, Windows 7 to Windows 10, when we have third-party disk encryption that may not survive an in-place upgrade. So those scenarios especially will use refresh. New PC means there's no state to migrate. That's a new user, new PC. PC replacement also involves a new PC, but it has the component of how do I get the user the apps and their old stuff, their old files and settings they need onto the new device. And finally, an upgrade, which is something else that we can automate through things like Configuration Manager to make sure that we have predictable outcomes and can do things like maybe replace apps, replace drivers along the way, and have automated routines for if Windows doesn't like something and rolls back the install, how we get it back to the state that it was prior to running the upgrade. So first off, some of the imaging considerations. We continue to advocate a thin imaging approach where apps aren't pre-installed, where the image is agnostic of device manufacturer and type. Things can be customized in real time as part of the deployment. That way you've got fewer images to manage. Also, images are smaller and it's a bit more flexible in general. When we think about automated imaging and creating custom images, MDT is still a very strong and great recommendation, especially when you're going to do a build and capture process. And these can be used as part of your config manager environment as well later. But MDT is a very powerful tool to do this and can be used for image capture. It can also be used in cases where you don't have config manager infrastructure in place, and want to do task sequence-based deployment. Driver and firmware management, it's fluctuated over the years, but the main thing is you need to worry about drivers and firmware. A lot of them can be managed via app installation packages, but that's not consistent. So what we do have are a few options. One, app packages. Two, the raw driver files. You can inject them in as part of your image servicing passes, or if you detect that a machine is, say, a Surface device, you can use that to target the MSI-based driver package that will be installed. Main thing is you've got to make the considerations based on how your OEMs actually deliver their driver packages for deployment and imaging. For Surface, all of that is in one site that I've created an AKA link for at aka.ms/surface drivers, and that also gives you the ability to get the driver files individually as well as the MSI packages, as you can see here. There's a nice tool that was created by a Microsoft MVP named Maurice Daly, who actually has looked through all the different hardware manufacturers and created an automated process to really try to get to a drivers as a service type model where you can import the right drivers in the best ways possible to manage your deployments at scale. So check that out if you want to see another way to manage drivers. Now, one of the things that you're going to use pretty much for any of the scenarios, maybe except for new computer, is going to be using task sequence-based deployment. Now, this is still something that probably a lot of you are using now, but you'll continue to use that moving forward. And the nice thing is it does all of the things that you could possibly want to do as part of an upgrade. It gives you ultimate control and power over the end-to-end process. Pre-installation, post-installation, state migration, setting up disk encryption, all of that stuff is stuff that you can do as part of a deployment task sequence. Nice thing is Config Manager also works with upgrades, and it's relatively recent that this has been the case. So you can do things like pre-installation checks. Here we see things like battery, removing incompatible applications or drivers, suspending third-party security or encryption, upgrading the operating system, then doing all the post-upgrade tasks that we see here. And then in the case of rollback, if you want to do something like, let's say I removed an app as part of the pre-upgrade step, I could say with Windows detected an issue, rolled back to previous version of the OS, then let's actually run a task to install that app that I just uninstalled as part of the pre-upgrade task. So a lot of power that you can do here. These are templatized task sequences that you can use to govern that process. Now, part of the deployment recommendation is to use deployment rings or phased deployment. This starts with a small group of insiders, and it gets grown out to a pilot group. That pilot group then grows to production. Along the way, you're looking and validating at the results of your deployments and ensuring at the insiders phase you've got a good collection of apps and hardware that you're testing. The pilot phase, you're also testing a corresponding relevant set of hardware and apps. And then as you're deploying, you're continually monitoring that approach to make sure that you can broaden to more and more seats effectively as you deploy. These are the things that we do as part of Microsoft servicing our hundreds of millions of consumer-based PCs. You might be part of the Insiders program. We're basically advocating a similar set of deployment rings for your internal deployment. So it's not a try to get everything deployed over one weekend approach, but make sure that the quality goals are met and that your expectations are met as part of an upgrade. So I mentioned co-management before and some of the things that you can do when you attach Configuration Manager to cloud services like Intune. But in addition to that, you can do things like use cloud distribution points, which basically give you a means of storing through Azure Blob Storage deployment source up into Azure, and Cloud Management Gateway, which is a path for Azure to read the right settings to apply to clients that connect to cloud for config manager based servicing, so you can distribute the same policies down to those machines without requiring what you might have used a VPN connection for in the past. Nice thing with Cloud Management Gateway is that you can use that to actually configure a Cloud DP really easily with the one checkbox that you see here as part of Cloud Management Gateway properties. So this is something that's very easy to configure. and very easy to get up and running and really leverage the cloud in a way that frees you up in terms of having to manage VPN and network saturation potentially over VPN when you're doing large-scale deployments. So you can offload some of that to the internet effectively into the cloud via Azure. Now, Windows Autopilot is a new capability, especially for new hardware where you actually work with an OEM to have the machine registered against your Azure AD tenant. That way, when you create a deployment profile, you can have the machine snap to that deployment profile so that it's business ready. Once a user receives the device, they will unpack it and get it ready basically set it up through normal out-of-box experience, and through Autopilot with a combination of Intune, you can customize the setup experience so only the screens that are seen. For example, you can skip the end user licensing agreement. You can make the user a standard user versus a local admin, even though they're the first person to set up the machine. You can then install all the apps that you want installed on that device using Intune as the approach to install those application packages. So a couple things with Autopilot to be aware of. One, it is something that doesn't require you to take machines into inventory, re-image them, rebox them, and send them out to users. It's also easier from an image management perspective if you're using OEM images that are customized, sending them to your hardware providers. This basically says we can customize the OEM's image that they apply. Ideally, they're using things like a signature style image where there's not additional unwanted apps in that image. Then curating that to the specs that you want. This can be combined with things like OneDrive no folder move. You can do things like change the SKU of Windows, say from Pro to Enterprise, all through policy automation that you're going to manage via OneDrive. So it's a very powerful solution that you can do. Now, the way to set up an Autopilot deployment profile is what you're going to use as you determine which machines are getting deployed which settings. So you basically go into device enrollment as part of Intune. Then you're going to select a name and also the deployment mode. So for user-driven, which means they're going to get a customized out-of-box experience, you can select how they join Azure AD. So if you wanted Azure AD joined, you can then configure the out-of-box experience to hide the licensing agreement, hide privacy settings if you want to do that on behalf of users. Change the account type to standard, which is a huge security capability, so that that's a standard user out of the gates. And then applying computer name templates if you want to make sure that the naming hits your naming standards as well. Nice thing with Autopilot is you can use that with an existing configuration manager environment. And as part of your task sequence based deployment to say a Windows 10 to Windows or Windows 7 to Windows 10 scenario, you can have that computer enroll into the service and then receive all of what it needs to get the Autopilot capabilities assigned to it. So it's going to give its hardware ID to the service. It's going to abide by. It's going to be part of the collection that you're going to group those machines into, and it will use your deployment profile, kind of like we just saw in the illustrated example, to where it will have the same user experience. And the nice thing is once it's enrolled, it's part of Autopilot, part of Intune, part of Azure AD. The next time I reassign that device to a second or third user and just reset it, it's going to go through the Autopilot deployment experience, so you don't have to redeploy that machine again. Now, the way that actually works, and this is just a quick, we're not going to go through the entire install of Windows here, but once you kick off a task sequence, basically it's going to execute the normal configuration manager refresh task sequence. It applies this JSON file that you just saw that will do the things to make the Windows Autopilot stuff light up. And here we see the custom out-of-box experience already with just a few screens, the keyboard settings. And here we can see the progress screen that will be able to keep up until all the apps and things are deployed and ready to go. And then once you're done, the device is ready and in a business-ready state. So the user has all the apps they need, and it's enrolled into Intune and Azure AD with all the policies required. So a couple things to note for feature updates. One, use upgrade task sequences in Config Manager if you own Config Manager. So These are things that will save you a lot of time. They don't require you migrating your files or your apps from old machine or from old install to new install. Physics-wise, just user experience-wise, matching what they very previously had in terms of the apps and files and locations, that's going to be your cleanest option. And when you get to Windows 10, moving from previous versions of Windows 10 to newer versions, hopefully it's a no-brainer, but you should be using upgrade sequences to manage that. And over time, as drivers and any compatibility challenges get increasingly more and more predictable, you'll be able to use policy to do this at scale. Also, you can use Windows Analytics for data-driven collection and collection targeting to make sure that all of your devices are ready for deployment. You can, if you don't want to do that, scan compatibility via setup controls. We have the command line here that you use as part of setup.exe. And you can do offline image servicing with monthly updates, runtimes, packages as shown before as part of your update. Things not to do that you shouldn't be doing. Don't wipe and reload from Windows 10 to Windows 10 scenarios. A lot of pain that you can avoid by using upgrade sequences or in-place upgrades, especially from 10 to 10 versions. And in cases where you validated that everything is working and you don't have third-party disk encryption holding you back, 7 to 10 upgrades as well. Don't skip device and app validation, and don't forget about quality updates. Since the feature update was released, you can inject those into an offline image so that the second that machine goes up to date or gets upgraded, that will have the latest security patches and capabilities in it. One of the ways that you will do the package updates is through PowerShell. So this is just an example of a script that will mount an ISO, within the ISO mount the WIM, go to a folder that's finding all of the packages that are there and inject all of the packages located into from that path into the image, then reseal the WIM file, reseal the ISO, and now it's ready to go for an in-place upgrade. So there are ways to automate this process to where it is as simple as just running this PowerShell file after you've put all of the updates that you want into these package paths as shown here in this example. As mentioned before, we can use upgrade sequences. So this is just a nice fully populated operating system upgrade sequence for Config Manager and all the things that you might want to do as part of that upgrade, including application incompatible app removal. For example, here we see that we want to uninstall one of our line of business apps, and then we can upgrade the OS. We can do post OS upgrade processing, for example, replacing the LEDBat that we just removed. And then the nice thing is, for example, if we want to install more apps, upgrade the version of Office, we can do that. And even if we find an issue with like the rollback, we can roll back to that Contoso LEDBat version 1 if Windows found an issue and cannot upgrade. All right, so Windows Virtual Desktop. This is another option if you're already using virtual desktop virtualization, something you should look into. Big news here is that you can have multiple concurrent users in a Windows 10 client OS experience. Doesn't require a server for concurrent user login. All this is delivered on Azure and optimized for ProPlus, one of the recent acquisitions that we made around FS Logics will make that even better from a file management perspective. The nice thing is you can either do breadth or depth scaling based on the needs of your organization. All right, so now we're deployed. Now we want to make sure that we maintain that deployment state. A couple of things to prepare for: semi-annual feature updates for Office and Windows, making sure that you have insider and pilot teams already sought out, that you're using that as part of your servicing, and that you're preparing for updates with the tools that you're going to be using, whether that is Config Manager or policies like Windows Update for Business type policies that you're going to manage either through Group Policy or through Intune. And then that you can operationalize this so it's part of just the standard semi-annual update process. So first off, you're going to be using Windows Analytics again as part of this process, or Desktop Analytics once it's available. and that's going to give you the systems that are ready for the upgrade. You'll notice that there will be less work once you've made it from Windows 7 to Windows 10, but this will give you a nice assessment of the machines ready for deployment. You can also use, as mentioned, policies for your updates. So this is just a show of where the Windows Update for Business policies are. You can see what the policies are around preview builds or feature updates. I can enable automatic update. I can set up the channel that I want. So in most cases, we're going to set up semi-annual channel full, like not the targeted one's a pre-release version. For targeted, I might set that up for my IT department. I can then set up a delay, for example, 10 days if I want to make sure that I have the enough peace of mind that there's been some testing of that. And then I can also set up pauses when I don't want updates going out. So maybe I've got tax season, Black Friday, you name it. There might be a compelling event that I have to pause updates for those events. Now you can also set up deployment rings as part of Intune. So just to show here, we have a pilot group, an insider group, and a production group. Clicking into the pilot group, you'll see just a couple of the settings that we have. So the properties that are configured are located in the pilot properties tab in this case, and you can see kind of what the install times are selected. A lot of the things that we saw in the group policy controls that were there across all the different options are things that we can do here, in addition to a bit more granularity in terms of targeting of active hours and those types of things that are other Windows Update settings across other areas of group policy and your ADMX files. You can set up, for example, in a production queue, maybe the setting's going to have a longer delay of 60 days or 30 days for a feature update. Of course, during that time, you can continue to refer to get quality updates. So you see the deferral time period there is only 10 days. So you're only always within 10 days of being most up to date from a quality update perspective. You can tighten that number up if you want to, but this will give you a 60-day gap between the feature update release and when that's applied to a broader production deployment device. Nice thing here too is that because you have that 60-day window, if you were to see something that's compelling, maybe an incompatibility or user experience or something that would give you pause in terms of broadening the deployment, because there are literally 2 months there, as long as you keep that delay in mind, you can go in and change this policy or stop feature updates from happening on your own terms. So this gives you all that flexibility, and it's a nice kind of safety net in terms of if you're not proactively deploying out to these systems, they will still continue to get this, whether they're connected to your policy or distribution points or not. This policy is local, so it will go and find the update from Windows Update. All right, so that goes into servicing. What's Windows as a service? These are basically twice yearly feature updates and monthly quality and security updates. The updates for quality are cumulative. They include security fixes, reliability fixes, bug fixes, and supersede previous months of updates because they are cumulative. Feature updates are delivered twice per year. 18 months of servicing for feature update releases targeting March, and 30 months for feature updates that are targeting September. They support rollback. They're reliable. You can use them as part of Insider Preview. Now, some of the things to keep in mind, again, from a supportability standpoint, this was announced on September 6th. Everything up to 1607 to 1803 will have 30 months of support. The builds targeting September will continue to get 30 months of support. And the per previous policy, the builds that are targeting March will have 18 months of support. Likewise, all the Office 365 ProPlus builds, the semi-annual channel, will get 18 months of support. Speaking of that, this is the way the Office update channels work. There is a monthly channel which includes features. Those first then appear in the semi-annual channel targeted, which is kind of a test or validation build that you can use as part of your insider ring, for example, and in your pilot ring, and then you can roll that out to semi-annual channel that will receive that a few months after the targeted channel begins. Main thing to note here is that even, for example, the last monthly channel version that you see here will have been in testing in production with full support for typically 5+ months before it even appears in the semi-annual channel. For example, this build will be already, before it's in semi-annual channel, there for 10 months before you see that. So that means, we're not inundating users with new features. It's all under the control of you as the customer. You have the ability to select the channel, and if you do select semi-annual channel, there is a nice delay between when that feature initially ships and all the time we have to validate it in market before you see it in semi-annual channel. So even though these are supported, this gives you even more peace of mind that all of these capabilities have been fully validated prior to them being released to your broad production deployment rings. Now, the last thing to go over is user communication and training. Now, again, even the best technology sometimes won't cause users to change the way that they work or the way that they interact with their desktops. This is where it's part of the IT process and part of your deployment to plan for how you communicate new capabilities out to end users so that they take advantage of all of those things mentioned: cloud connectivity, productivity enhancements, security enhancements, maybe multi-factor authentication, biometric, all those things that you're doing as part of the desktop upgrade. First resource to mention, productivity library, lots of video-based content to help train users on the modern approaches for productivity and teamwork. These are free resources that you can use as part of your communication. Another great set of free content that was released as part of the way that Microsoft actually internally rolled out Windows 10 is to use the Win 10 IT Showcase content, and that basically gives you things to promote even the rollout of the new desktop, email templates, those types of things that you might use to communicate what's coming in the upgrade for users, even posters if you want to print them out, intranet web banner displays, digital displays, like all these things that you might use internally as part of your rollout, just to make sure that users know that the modern desktop is coming and they can prepare for it. Finally, you'll want to track users' usage through things like the Office or Microsoft 365 admin centers. You can also track that through Power BI and some of the reporting that you have there that you can see whether or not people are, for example, moving from using attached files inside of email to using things like OneDrive and file sharing or SharePoint file sharing. These are all metrics that you can track over time by different user populations in your organization. The last thing to mention here is that Fast Track is a service that you can use to help drive usage internally. They're also the organization behind Desktop Aperture, but specializing really in things like Office 365 ProPlus, Azure AD, driving usage, making sure that you get the value out of Microsoft 365 and all the cloud-connected services. So with that, I'll conclude with a few desktop deployment resources. First, the one site to know about to promote to your audiences how to shift. So aka.ms/howtoshift is the link for the Modern Desktop Deployment Center. All of that is in video content form as well on Microsoft Mechanics if you go to aka.ms/watchhowtoshift. Now the labs corresponding to the same deployment process wheel, everything is on aka.ms/howtoshift labs. So you can go hands-on with all these tools and more of what we mentioned in this session. And of course, continue to engage with Fast Track. Thank you so much for joining and learning how you can deploy and plan for a deployment of Windows 10 and Office 365 ProPlus using tools like System Center Configuration Manager and more. And remember, you've got until June 14th, 2020 for end of support of Windows 7 and in October of 2020 for Office 365 ProPlus. Hopefully you have the tools to make those deadlines, and we'll see you in the communities.